Welcome to Reach, your platform to connect with other executive assistants and acquire game-changing knowledge and perspective. Reach is designed to inspire your workday, guide you through pivotal moments in your career, and transform you into the executive assistant you've always wanted to be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Reach. This is your host, Jessica Vann, the founder and CEO of Maven Recruiting Group. And today I have a delightful guest. I'm joined by Ninni Vanni. Hi, Ninni.
Hi, good morning, Jess.
Good morning. So good to have you. Ninni is a C-level executive assistant who has worked in the field for over 10 years at companies such as Rula, ON24 and Zuora, where she supported the CEOs. Ninni holds a master's degree in communication, bringing a wealth of knowledge, not just from a practical perspective, but also from a theoretical, ideological perspective. So wealth of knowledge and expertise to the table to weigh in on today's topic, which is how to perfect the art of communication and really understand the effect that communication can have on your role as an executive assistant, but also on your broader EA brand. With a background finely tuned to the nuances of effective communication, Ninni is uniquely positioned to shed light on the role that communication plays in supporting executives, but also in managing the multifaceted and often very delicate and diplomatic communications that an executive assistant is often a part of. As we explore the importance of communication in this pivotal role of executive assistant, we will unravel the impact of skills like active listening, information streamlining, and of course, the delicate art of pushing back when necessary. Ninni's deep understanding of communication dynamics within and outside of organizations will undoubtedly provide valuable insights for both aspiring and seasoned executive assistants. So, Ninni, let's talk about this passion that you have for communication. What made you want to return to school to study communication? And how has this knowledge contributed to how you show up in your role as an assistant?
Yeah, Jessica, I'm excited. Let's get into it. So a large scope of the EA dynamic, and actually all relationship dynamics, is communication. And that's because it permeates every aspect of this position, right? From how we organize correspondence, how we coordinate meetings, to how we manage travel logistics. It is oftentimes the method also of how we communicate that is determined by who we support. And I think most EAs would agree with me that a big part of this job is about developing a communication style that complements who we support. And being adaptable in our communication practices is a vital tool for any EA. But the flip side of that interwovenness is that because the communication style needs to be so keyed into who we're supporting, at least for me, I found it challenging to find training programs that encompass the holistic nature of this role. So when I started out, although I had other EAs to lean on and learn from, and gained a fantastic amount of knowledge just from my day-to-day experiences, I still felt like I was consistently playing catch-up. And I wanted to proactively minimize the risks that came along with not knowing what I didn't know. And so after some research, I found a master's programs offered by Arizona State University, which I felt would enable me to, one, build upon the skills that I'd cultivated from the job, but two, give me an exposure and training on how to manage situations that I'd yet to come across in a low-stakes environment. And reflecting back, I do feel like I have more confidence as an EA after completing the program. For example, I feel more structured when I'm project managing. And I'm much more comfortable with things like managing up and dealing with conflict. And I feel like I have more tools in my arsenal to draw upon when I am faced with new challenges. And like, I'm not saying that a master's program is the only way to obtain these skills or confidence. Like, we all learn in our own ways, we all learn by our own pace. But for me, it was the most robust option that I could find that provided the type of development that I was looking for.
So when you pursued this master's program, it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like it was in the service of expanding your skill set within the EA realm and just being more of a master and more effective in that work, as opposed to wanting to pivot career directions. Is that accurate?
That's hitting the nail directly on the head. Um, when I started looking at the master's program, I'd actually been in EA for like 6.5, 7 years. And I experienced quite a lot of what you experience in the job. But like you said, I wanted to learn more. I knew that if I was able to develop more of the skills that I'd had, then I would be able to like up level being an executive assistant. And so that's why I went back to school. Not because I necessarily wanted to drive a new career choice, but because I wanted to excel in the career choice that I had.
Well, you have certainly done that. So I know you can't summarize the entire content of a 2-year master's program, but if you were to just kind of like very high level touch on some of the strategies, techniques, some of the key things that stood out to you in the program that you've been able to incorporate into your daily. Can you share some of those?
Sure, absolutely. I think for me, there's two things that stood out the most when it came to this program. One was it gave me a foundation base of like processes when it came to project managing. And furthermore, it gave me exposure about how to approach different types of projects that had different personas of contributors, right? Because there's a nuance that you have to take on when you're working with folks from either the same background, right? Like people in the same department, or people from cross-functional backgrounds. And certainly when you're dealing with people who are internal versus external stakeholders. And beyond that, I mentioned this earlier, but it helped me kind of get more confidence when it came to conflict resolution. Because instinctually, right, like I am not a natural conflict manager. I think it's something that is a part of life, but I tend to be more of a reactive than like somebody who's going to take action right away about it. And so the master's program, I think, again, gave me tools that helped me be like, okay, how can I proactively deal with a conflict before it becomes a major issue?
I love that. And I don't think that you're alone, Ninni, in saying that you sort of eschew conflict as an executive assistant. I think there are many executive assistants who would identify themselves in the same way and are loath to kind of engage on the battlefield and really kind of don't want to be in that position. And yet, conflict can be really big stuff, like really flaming, on fire kind of stuff, but it can also be just smaller kind of points of contention or just a need to correct something or correct a misunderstanding. So there's a lot of levels of conflict, but I think that developing that ability is really, really key. And it doesn't mean that you need to be, like a litigator by any means, but it does mean that having some kind of facility in being able to navigate those conversations is actually really, really vital. And like you say, it may not be the natural inclination of a lot of executive assistants. So, and we're going to touch on that later. So I think that's a good one to come back to. So when you think about the role of executive assistants in an organization and the way that they can kind of help to bridge communication gaps or sort of lubricate, disjointed communications within an organization, can you share some thoughts around how an EA might be able to do that and maybe some examples that you've encountered?
Yeah, I think, we kind of touched about this, but EAs do a lot of project management in our role. And that's because we bring a unique perspective of how workflows can be optimized. And so when you blend that with the natural skills we demonstrate in our day-to-day job, like being organized and hyper communicative, like we're natural badass PMs. And because of that, when an initiative requires support from different organizations, but doesn't necessarily fit into one department's roadmaps, like that's where EAs really shine, because we are, like you said, able to bridge those cross-functional initiative gaps. Take, for example, like building a board packet, right? Like this is a document that requires support and input from various department heads who, by the way, like they all have their own initiatives that they're focused on and travel schedules that need to be worked around and like their own department responsibilities that can't be ignored. And so these are busy individuals who are being asked and like sometimes forced, right, to take time away from their priorities to contribute to work that doesn't necessarily have an immediate impact on their goals. And it can be hard to get folks of this nature to lean in. And in order for something like the board deck to be executed well and on time, it requires an EA to be proactive and be able to anticipate when people are going to get hung up, and then preemptively build in safety nets to mitigate and minimize those risks, right? Like you hear a lot about how great EAs manage up, and I think this is just a good example of that. Like I think oftentimes people assume being an EA is a passive role, when in fact, like we are the unsung heroes of cross-functional team initiatives and deliverables. And I like, admittedly, I'm biased, but I think like all EAs, like we deserve kudos because that's a really hard role to fill.
100%. You can be biased as much as you want within this audience. I think you'll have plenty of support. Yeah, no, that's a really good example. You also said something when we first opened up the conversation. You said something about when you went back to get your master's, you wanted to learn about or how to think about how to complement your executive's communication style or how to be complementary. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Because I think there's something really interesting there. You know, depending on the kind of communicator your executive is and their particular style of communication, that may require a different level of involvement on the part of the EA, whether it's cleaning up comms that are messy, sloppy, non-existent, whatever the case may be. I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit more about what you meant by that comment.
Sure. So I'm gonna do that like annoying thing people do sometimes during podcasts where they sidestep the question a little bit. I think, you know, one way that would make sense to a lot of the listeners is executives have different voices that they use depending on who is on the receiving end of their communication, right? And that's something that an EA needs to almost be instinctually aware of, right? And so like the way an executive is going to talk to a board member or an investor is going to be different than the way they talk to somebody on their team. And one of the things that EAs need to be able to do is pivot in a natural and organic way that complements their executive's voice when they're talking to different personas, because there's a different dynamic within that relationship. And so one of the things that my master's program, again, taught me was, okay, how to do that in a way that is true to who you are as an executive assistant, but also doesn't deviate from what your executive's brand is, right? And so I think that's a really important skill set that EAs can have and that we need to showcase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think it's really interesting. Like, oftentimes as EAs, we're asked to mimic the voice of our executive, or, you know, whether it's through ghostwriting or, you know, reaching out on their behalf, or knowing kind of what their tonality would be, or how they would want you to handle a situation, which is really a lot of being able to observe and mimic, which I think is just a really interesting skill set to try to cultivate. Is, you know, how do you observe, how do you take on that persona at times, because that is often required of EAs in their comms.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just watched, this is such a non sequitur, but I just watched The Talented Mr. Ripley for like the second time, and I hadn't watched it in like 20 years. But it's like, if you think about him, like what a crazy character study he was, right? And how how he was able to pick up on all of the nuances and the tone and the word choice and the this and the that. Like it's so interesting.
Absolutely. That's a great example and a great movie.
Great. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So thinking about communication that involves addressing individuals at various levels of an organization, right? And you touched on this a moment ago about your executive maybe reaching out to board members or team members or things of that nature. But you as an executive assistant are also reaching out to different levels of individual, internally, externally, various degrees of seniority, things of that nature. So how does effective communication differ for an executive assistant when you're interacting, for instance, with internal versus external stakeholders, or when you're dealing with vendors versus VIPs, or how do you manage the different expectations and dynamics across leveling?
Yeah, I'm glad that we're digging into this a little bit more, because I think this is a skill that doesn't get enough visibility, but it's such an important part of how we as executive assistants show up for our role. And so for me, one way I try to utilize effective communication is to, like I said earlier, is to consider who's on the receiving end of that messaging and what that dynamic is of the relationship. And I do this because these all factor things like my language, tone, delivery, things that you said earlier too, that need to be considered when you're crafting effective communication. I'll take the example that you mentioned about, talking to somebody from within your organization from without versus somebody without. And so when I'm speaking with somebody from within my org, my language tends to be a little bit more informal, right? I'll use things like shorthand or acronyms or like sometimes even emojis. Like, I'm a millennial, we do that, and at least in my team, that's acceptable. Whereas I would almost never do that when communicating with a professional contact from outside the company. And again, that harks back to that idea, because these are two separate personas, right? Like, one's in an informal relationship while the other's a formal. And beyond that, when I'm communicating with an internal colleague, there's this universally understood vocabulary that's absent when I'm talking with somebody from an external background. Same thing for like vendors versus VPs, right? Like, the ultimate goal of both of those transactions is it's a transactional experience. It's an exchange of information. However, the role dynamics, once again, factor into how I approach these communications. So, for example, with a vendor, my communication tone stems from the perspective of being the client, right? Like, I'm the decision maker in this dynamic. And they need to ultimately provide me with a service. Whereas with a VP, like, that's flipped. And my communication style has to reflect the change in that role shift. Where the VIP, they're the client. And so now I need to shift my tone to be more focused around providing an exceptional service while creating a positive experience. And so these are just a few examples of how I would utilize effective communication styles to mediate different relationships that also are emblematic of how my executive would manage those relationships. But I do believe you should always lead with respect, empathy, and practice active listening, no matter who you're speaking to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you speak to the importance of brevity or of mirroring in communication? So what I mean by that is, if someone communicates and has a lot of brevity in how they communicate, right? They're very to the point, and there's not a lot of fluff. Do you think that it's important to try to mirror your comms to be more similar to theirs in order to be a little bit more easily understood, or to be a little bit more kind of pleasing to their ear or their palate? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you're touching on there, right, is you as an executive assistant, you are just by nature and just by osmosis, you're an extension of your executive, right? And so they have a persona that they've cultivated within different types of relationships. And in order to maintain that persona, that brand, you need to be able to, as you said, mirror the intention that they have when they are articulating themselves within that dynamic. And so, for example, sometimes there are some relationships that they tend to be more relaxed and friendly, and they're going to make small talk in, and so that should cue you, if you observe them doing that, to also take that approach when you are communicating with that individual. And there are other times, like you said, when they have a little bit more, like they're just cut dry, they want to get to the point. And that can also be influenced by the situation at hand, right? Like sometimes they need information, stats. Sometimes they're going to be asking for something that's after hours, but it is critical. And so you need to be able to mirror and adjust your communication approach so that it communicates not only the message itself, but the context in which that message needs to be delivered.
Yes, I 100% agree with you. And I think this is a nice transition to the next question I want to talk to you about, which is active listening. And I think that when you are actively and attentively listening or witnessing how someone communicates, I think there are so many cues in that for you. And for example, and I practice this in my own work with clients, is, if a particular client has a very formal way of engaging or communicating, I'm immediately going to course correct and make sure that I am using all my SAT words and really making sure that I'm being more poignant, more thoughtful, more formal, all of those things. And then I have some clients that are, all about the emojis and are very comfortable with slang, and it's more about efficiency as opposed to refinement. But going back to this topic of active listening, which we've touched on a little bit so far, this is often cited as a crucial skill set for executive assistants. So I'd love to hear from you. How can EAs enhance their active listening abilities? And, what does it mean to be a good active listener? And how, in your opinion, does this skill contribute to overall effectiveness and success in the role?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think being a good listener, right, is just like a natural part of being a good EA. But again, I think people often assume that the art of listening is a passive one, when in reality, EAs not only need to hear what a speaker is saying, but we also need to understand the context of the messaging and be able to respond and oftentimes repeat that information to others. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Like sometimes when you're delivering a message to a peer, and it's in a more informal space, the tone and the language that you're using is going to reflect that. Whereas when you're talking to somebody who has maybe a little bit more of seniority, your tone might change and the language you use might change to do that. But as an EA, you need to be able to hear those nuances and hear that context when your executive is demonstrating it or talking to you. And that's hard because not only do we have to correctly capture new information and usually do that in a short amount of time, but we also have to anticipate its potential downstream impacts to avoid future pitfalls or misinforming somebody. And this is where active listening comes in handy. So a few ways that I found that help me be a more effective active listener include, first, like when I do need to have syncs with my executive, is being strategic about when I coordinate those times, right? So like not going to schedule time with them 5 minutes before a board meeting, right? Like they're not going to be in the right headspace to engage in a conversation. And ultimately I would be setting myself up for failure. And what I mean by being strategic is that, like, I'm going to carve out time where they can focus on the conversation and where I have an opportunity to ask follow-up questions. So then I don't have to go back to them later on and be like, hey, remember this we talked about? Like, can you repeat that? Because, like, that's awful. And so I'm going to find a time that works well for the individual I'm supporting. And one of the ways, a few times that I think have just always been a good opportunity for these touch points is either at the end of the day, right, when we're not so time bound by the next appointment or the next meeting they have, or after lunch, after they've had some time to, like, be alone and collect their thoughts and have eaten, right? Because, like,
Oh,
hangers,
yes. Let's not
yeah,
underestimate the importance of blood sugar in effective communications.
Totally. Like, hanger is real and it does impact how we communicate. So, like, that's what I mean about being strategic when these things happen. Next, I'd make sure that when we do connect, that it's happening on a regular basis, right? And that's because priorities are subjective and they are constantly changing. And so I need to be in lockstep with what my executives' current priorities are and understand which ones are high value versus low value so that I can appropriately task manage. And finally, like, it's old school, but I make sure to be able to take notes during any of our discussions because this really helps me be able to execute on crucial details, but more importantly, acts like a backup checklist to make sure that I've not forgotten something, or worse, like I said earlier, right? Like, it's just awful when you have to go back to your executive and say, like, I didn't catch that, or I wasn't listening, or, like, what, can you repeat yourself? And so these are just some tactics that, although are pretty basic, right? Like, I found really do help me be a more effective active listener, which ultimately makes me better at my job.
Yeah. Now, are you reflecting in these conversations? So, for example, are you saying, okay, great, CEO, what I heard, what I heard you say in terms of the most pressing priorities are X, Y, and Z? Or are you just taking the information, absorbing it, processing it, making note of it, and moving on?
I think it depends, right, on the dynamic. Particularly when you're starting out, newly supporting somebody, being able to quickly synthesize, like, what their top priorities are and what you guys discussed is helpful. And it's helpful to make sure that, one, you're understanding the context that they're giving you and the information. And two, it kind of, like, helps build your street cred. It demonstrates that, like, look, I heard what you said. I know what I need to do with this information. And here's what I'm going to do as a follow-up, right? Like, this is what I'm accountable for. And then once you kind of develop that cadence and you develop that trust, you don't necessarily have to do that as often. But if it is a critical priority or initiative or something that's high stakes, I think it's always a good practice to do that. Do a quick, like, one or two sentence summary of, okay, here's what I heard, here's what I'm going to do. And then you don't have to say anything else because they will interject. They will tell you if, like, you need to recalibrate, right? Like, because ultimately you are acting on behalf of them and you're taking workload off of them. So they want to make sure that you're doing it correctly just as much as you are.
100%. So we talked about the importance of approaching at opportunistic times or opportune times, right? Being mindful and sensitive of that. I think another thing I'd like to hear your opinion of is how you streamline, and I like to call it packaging information, right? So I think, like, it's kind of like when you're, the way that you can compose and present the information in such a way as to reduce the amount of clutter, context shifting, just kind of noise, right? So how do you go about packaging information and effective information management. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you approach that. And then, in follow up, maybe you can talk about how this has positively impacted decision making, or, allowed your executives to get to resolutions or decisions easier or faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I'm sure I've said this one or two times before in this podcast, so maybe in my responses. So feel free to edit this out if I have. But I think this is really one of the biggest ways EAs make an impact for their executives. And it speaks to the trust that's fostered between an EA and whomever they're supporting, right? It's hard to quantify, but I can't emphasize enough the significance of being able to absorb that constant stream of information that's coming at your exec, and then distilling it down, or, using your phrase, repackaging it down to the need to knows, so they can make a quick but informed decision or response. And I think an obvious example of this that a lot of listeners could relate to is calendar management, right? There's an endless flow of competing meeting requests coming in at any one time. And so in order to ensure that my exec's time is being effectively utilized, before scheduling a meeting, I need to understand the purpose of the meeting, who the key stakeholders are, make sure they're actually attending the meeting, right? And then knowing in advance what information my exec needs to have so they can come prepared for that discussion. And if any of these elements are missing, I risk underutilizing their time. And that's an ultimate loss for me. That is awful as an executive assistant. And so one approach that I use to streamline information to make sure that we've got everything we need checked off is I keep an up-to-date doc that organizes current tasks by category. And then under each of those tasks, I list 1 to 2 key subpoints of information that they need to know, along with what the next steps are for that task. And this helps because, one, it provides a current single source of truth that my exec can drop into at any time without having to come to me or tap me or call me. And at a glance, it gives them at a glance, they can see the progress of any given task. And it also assures them that I've got my eye on the ball and that they can trust me to manage things. And it gives them the focus back to what they actually need to prioritize and deal with at that time. But when the inevitable issue comes up, if appropriate, I do try to devise a solution on my own first without having to ask them to solve it for me. And I think that comes with time, right? You can't always necessarily do that off the bat, but once you've got a foundation of trust between you and your executive, and they know that you know what to look out for, this is really, really helpful. And so when I do need their input during one of these challenges, I like to make sure that I come with a resolution that has 1 or 2 supporting points that justify my reasoning for that result. And that helps showcase the rationale behind my suggestion. And it also enforces that trust and then lets them know that hey, I'm a true thought partner, and I have taken into consideration the things that I think you would need to know before making this choice, right? And I think most importantly, when you're able to do that, when you're able to be an effective listener, but also able to take that information and package it in a way that they know that you're keeping an eye out for the details that are important to them, it lightens the burden of decision making for them. And when an executive assistant can reduce the amount of noise coming at their exec and can cut back the burden of decision making, that's powerful. That is the power of an effective EA, because it immediately alleviates your executive's time spent on low-hanging fruit and allows them to focus on whatever they need to focus on with minimal distraction.
I'm so glad we're recording, because I love every single thing you just said. And I think that there's so much wisdom and truth in what you just shared. I love, well, I'd actually love to know a little bit more about this doc that you use. Like what, if we were scanning this doc, like what might be something that you would have on this doc, and what would be some of the sub points that you mentioned?
I mean, it's not a glamorous doc, right? Like it's pretty basic, but it's supposed to be because I want to make sure that my executive can just digest it at like literally within 1 to 2 minutes, like they're caught up on everything. And so the way that I parse it out is I have like internal, external, personal, and then travel, and because those are kind of the four orbits in which my executive is currently involved in. And then under each of those, I'll have like little parts broken out just depending on what's happening. So for example, right, like if it's board deck building time, I will have a different section under the internal, and I will have like the task list, and then actually in a different color, I will list the 1 to 2 points that I think that they need to know, along with then a separate color what the action items are. And that color coding I think is really powerful. You know, we've talked about this before about like how we can organize our thoughts in a way that is helpful to our executives to not have to use any of their own brain power when digesting information. But the color coding just enhances that, right? So if they want to see where we are with the board doc, great. They know that there's 2 bullet points in blue that are going to highlight that. If they just want to know what the next step is, great. That next bullet point is going to be in green. And they're going to be like, great, okay, I can parse out the information that I want at any given second. And of course, like if there's something critical that they need to be aware of, I have it in red. And that signifies to them that like, hey, big flashing lights, look over here. Like I need you to address this. And we do this, at least currently at my current role, we use Google Docs because it's super helpful for them to be able to leave comments as well. And then I can also drop in likewise at any given time and be like, hey, you know, what has my exec looked at? What have they not looked at yet? Particularly when it refers to those really important red items. Like if I see that my exec hasn't commented on those, I know that they've not looked at those. And then it also acts as like a prompt for me to raise the flag and be like, hey, you know, I need you to look at this, or I need you to be aware of this.
Yeah. I mean, I love so many things in this. And I think one thing that I really love that's standing out to me is the fact that you design your updates specifically to be digested and processable within 1 to 2 minutes. I think that's such an important point because to me that demonstrates your understanding of how impacted your executive is, and it really demonstrates how you sympathize and how you empathize with their situation, and that how you're actively looking to reduce burden on their shoulders. And I think that there's no better way of exhibiting that than in creating, you know, effective docs and effective communications that don't add another layer of burden, but rather, you know, it's taking the information, it's making it streamlined, concise, precise. It's not TLDR, right? Like it's really being mindful of that. And I think that how you show up and how you conduct yourself and how you convey all of these things really demonstrates your understanding of how busy and impacted their time is. And I think that's one of the greatest ways that you can show that you get it, right? That you actually get them and you understand them. The other thing that I love that you said, and I really hope everyone heard this too, is that you don't ever bring problems that don't first have some kind of a stab at a solution. And maybe your solution is not 100% perfect. Fine, great. They often aren't. But now it's an iterative discussion versus shifting the entire burden on your executive to figure it out. You're like, okay, well, here's what I've come up with. Here's the actions I've taken. Here's what I'm proposing we do. And here's, you know, the ramifications of this plan. And then they can give you input. They can say, well, you know, let's go ahead and proceed with your plan, but let's do X, Y, and Z a little bit differently. I think that's such an important skill set. And I think that's one that oftentimes, you know, we're not necessarily trained in that way, and or it's a developing area of opportunity for people. And I'm thinking about a conversation I had with my daughter this past weekend. She was out mowing the lawn, and she hit a pothole in the dirt, whatever, and knocked the wheel right off the lawnmower. And she was like, she comes to me and she goes, "Well, I can't finish mowing the lawn because there's no wheel, so that's done." And I looked at her and I was like, "So it sounds to me like you're bringing me a problem, but you're not bringing me a solution." And she was like kind of dumbfounded. She's also 13, but she was like kind of dumbfounded. And I said, "I need you to go back out. I need you to think about some solutions and then come back to me with the problem, but give me a solution with the problem." And, and she was a little bewildered at first, but she came back like 15 minutes later and she's like, "Okay." She's like, "So here's what I did. I figured out that we can buy a replacement wheel." She went on YouTube. She figured out how to replace the wheel. And then she went on Home Depot's website and figured out that she could order the part for $30. And I was like, now we have a solution, right? So it's like, I feel like that's a really important skill set. And especially if you're supporting executives, you have to know that the absolute last thing that they want in their life is one more problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And first off, I would love to just be a fly on the wall, Jessica, in your house. Like the amount of insight and knowledge you have about, problem solving and developing skills, both personally and professionally. Like I am sure there are some fascinating conversations happening. And good on your daughter. That's a great way to resolve this. And I think, as somebody who regularly Googles things and YouTubes things to train myself or learn how to solve a problem, like she's on the right track, man. That's awesome.
Thank you for that. The next, I think, skill set that we both know is a big one with communications is being able to push back, and doing this with finesse and diplomacy, but also impact, right? Like not being so gentle and so, sensitive that you're actually ineffective in getting your point of view across. So how can executive assistants tactfully challenge decisions or provide an alternative perspective through how they position information or how they push back? And of course, like always keeping in mind that they don't want to, it's this delicate dance between getting your point across and pushing back on authority, but also not jeopardizing the relationship or compromising themselves in some way. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think it's just like naturally a tough one because of the functionality of EAs, right? But it's also an important aspect of the EA exec dynamic. I think oftentimes we as EAs are subject to being like the default catch-alls, but we don't always get an opportunity to weigh in on what projects get allocated to us. And look, like sometimes there's just aspects of this role that aren't going to spark joy for us, right? Like for some people, that's expense reports. Others, it's booking travel. But like these are just kind of parts of the gig. And in this instance, like it's probably not appropriate to push back. But if there is a situation that you truly don't agree with, then you should speak up and, but you need to be able to do so in a way that is respectful of the partnership. And so if and when I've needed to have these types of conversations with my executive, the first thing I would do is one, have these conversations with my executives. And what I mean by that is like not do it in front of or with others. Like, and I'm not saying you can't go and gut check with your peers, but you should always go directly to your executive when it comes to talking about the points of friction within your dynamic. And next, I would also be mindful about choosing the right time. a lot of negotiation, like a lot of the influence that has is based on timing, right? And like you don't want to wait a week after a decision has been made, because odds are the window in order to change that decision has passed. And you don't want to have to cause your executive to go back and then like cause a pull downward, spiral of backup work. Um, so making sure that when you are approaching these conversations, that they happen in a timely manner. And then finally, I would try to come up, and like we've talked about this before, example with your daughter, great example, but like when you do come up and raise these points of friction, be sure to have an alternative approach, again, that has like reasonable support. And this ties back to our earlier point about reducing the burden of decision making for your executive, because you want to make sure that you're detracting from their mental load, not adding to it. And so if you can provide evidence for your alternative suggestion and why it makes sense, I do think this will dramatically improve the odds in your favor for influencing that decision. And it shows that you're not just pushing back out of personal bias, right? Like, and listen, like these types of conversations, they're never fun. And they are a little awkward, especially because our execs are so used to hearing yes from you, right? But like, if you do feel strong about a situation or a decision, then there is value in raising your hand. And I do think, oftentimes you will be surprised about the weight of your own voice.
What's an example that comes to mind where you've had to have a conversation like this? And because again, there could be situations that impact you personally. For instance, your executive said something to you or conducted themselves in such a way toward you that made you feel uncomfortable, and you want to course correct that's kind of one set of things. Or it could be that the way that they handled a situation, or the way that the residual impact of how they handled a situation, you observed there was, there were some problematic residual consequences, and you want to make them aware of that, or something along those lines. So, I mean, there's so many different examples that could come up. I'm curious if there's one that comes to mind that you've been in, and how you phrased your rebuttal.
Sure. So one example that comes to mind is, and I mentioned this earlier, like being an executive assistant, we tend to be catch-alls. I had someone from my executive's department just kind of ping me out of the blue. And this wasn't an individual that I normally work with. And they just said, hey, Ninni, like you need to do X, Y, and Z by this day. And I was just a little taken aback by that directive, because it wasn't something that fell under the umbrella of tasks that I normally manage. And so, of course, I was like, I said, hey, such and such, like, thanks for reaching out. Let me gather some more detail on this, and then I'll come back to you if I have any questions. And so I then went to my executive and let them know that, I had been reached out to for this task. And one, were they aware of it? Because I do think sometimes, particularly when you're supporting an org, like people will try to test the waters and see what they can potentially offload to you, right? But two, like making sure that they were aware that this was being allocated to me. And to my surprise, they were like, yeah, I told them to reach out to you. And it wasn't like necessarily a hard task, but it was one that would require a decent amount of my time and my focus. And I just don't think that they had an understanding of the scope of the project. And so like, I didn't push back. I wasn't like, no, I'm not going to do this. But I did say, hey, okay, I'm happy to do this, but that does mean that I'm going to have to step back from these other initiatives that you and I are trying to focus on because I need to do X, Y, and Z in order to complete this. And so this is an example of, right, like where I'm coming with, like, I'm not pushing back out of a bias. I'm not just shutting down and saying, no, I'm not gonna lean in for this, but I am going to point out information that they might not be privy to and let them know, like, what the impact of me refocusing from my current priorities to address this one is going to be, and that it will cause me to have to take my foot off the accelerator in some other areas. And after doing so, like they were like, oh, I didn't realize that it was going to require all of this extra work. And, actually, now that I think about it, that shouldn't fall under your umbrella. Like, this individual really, they should be the taskmaster of that. And then I made sure to, like, end that conversation with, okay, would you like me to let them know that? Or do you want to have that conversation? And that way we knew, again, like what the next steps were. It wasn't just this like open-ended, okay, who's going to take the ball now, right? And I did say, like, I'm happy to have this, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page, because odds are they might come back to you and say, hey, Ninni's not doing this. And I want to make sure that you're aware of that. And so that's kind of one of the examples that I can think of that, I think part of this job is being confidential with some details, but I hope it demonstrates, like,
oh, absolutely,
you have power to say, like, hey, I don't know if this necessarily fits within what you and I are focused on, and not necessarily like seem like you're not willing to do certain aspects, or you're not willing to take on new challenges.
Yeah. And I think that the structure of how you handle that conversation is what's the really important takeaway here of, structurally it was, thank you for bringing this to my attention, right? Getting the clarity that this was in fact something your executive wanted you to do, but then framing the consequences, right? And again, like, I think that's the takeaway that's really effective for, I think, our listeners, is being able to understand kind of how to structure that dialogue. And then when you present the consequences, it's them saying, okay, great, no, I'm actually good with that. You can go ahead and reprioritize so you can do this person's thing. Or, oh my goodness, as your boss said, oh my goodness, no, I don't want you to do that. So I think that was a really great example of how somebody can, again, package or present that information to just to clarify, right? I think that's so valuable. And I think the other big thing is I don't feel like you lost face whatsoever in how you handle that. It doesn't sound like anyone's feathers were ruffled. It doesn't sound like there was any big backlash. It was more just everybody was expressing their needs and expressing their constraints, and then just having a rational discussion around it.
Exactly. And that, again, tying back to the theme of communication, like the nuances, the way that you approach this discussion, all of that is going to influence how the relationship is cultivated, right?
Thinking about your EA brand, right? And how effective communication is so central to how you both build but also maintain this professional EA brand. Are there specific steps that an EA can take or can think about in terms of how to establish and reinforce this brand through the way they communicate?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, like, Jessica, I gotta ask, do you come up with these questions? Because these are some like awesome questions.
Yeah, this is a partnership with Haley, who because she has been the one to be communicating with you. But Haley is in charge of brand and partnership and marketing for Maven, and she runs this podcast. And so she and I typically will work together on the questions and come up with them. I give her major kudos on pretty much absolutely everything.
well, yeah, Haley's great first and foremost. But yeah, these are awesome. So I second that, like second tally for kudos for her. Okay, so going back, right? You asked about branding and how EAs can use communication to establish their brand. Um, I think we know the power of branding, right? Like, there's actually a whole genre of influencers who've made like hand over fist money because they were able to capitalize on personal branding, right? But like, what's perhaps less clear is how these brands get established. And in no way, shape, or form do I claim to be an expert on brand building, but I do think there's one action that carries weight for anybody who's trying to establish themselves, and that's consistency, right? And that's because when we're consistent in our practices, it demonstrates a pattern where people begin to associate us with certain traits. For example, like when you're courteous and polite, you're a professional. When you follow up on requests, you're reliable. When you own up to a mistake, like you're accountable. And so when an executive trusts you and they trust that they know how you're going to show up, regardless of who's in the room, they're going to be more comfortable leaning on you to manage more complex and interesting work. And bonus, like it means that you get to work in a more autonomous fashion. But inversely, you know, when you do make a mistake, because we're not robots, at least not yet, you know, who knows what's going to happen with AI?
We're not yet robots.
Yeah, right. At least Scarlett Johansson, you know.
Right.
But for now, we're human, and because we are, mistakes are bound to happen. But when they do, they'll be viewed as aberrations. And like, I know this has been a long-winded answer, but I really can't overstate enough the importance of cultivating and maintaining a personal brand. And I think for folks who maybe haven't had an opportunity to think about this yet, there's a really easy way to start this process. And that's by asking yourself a few simple questions like, what 3 adjectives do I want to be professionally associated with? What does my current work habits contradict any of these traits? And what would my colleagues say are my strongest skills? And what would they say are my weakest? And when you answer these questions, you're able to establish what your brand encompasses and can gauge how you currently are recognized or are not. And that makes it a lot easier to drive consistent behaviors that will reinforce these trait associations, which ultimately helps shape how your peers view you and what your brand stands for.
I love that so much. I think that is such a great exercise, and I hope that everyone listening today does exactly that, takes a pen and a paper and sits down and asks themselves that very question of, what do I want to be known for? How do I want to be regarded? What kind of a legend am I looking to create, or a legacy, right? And then really considering what they need to do to be known or regarded in that way. I think that's so powerful. And to bring it back to communication, you know, how you communicate, how you show up, all the things you mentioned when you're, you know, professional, accountable, all of those things. I mean, those are really things that are impacted by how you communicate. And it really does. I think it's the root. Communication is the root of everything. So we talked about cultivating a professional brand. I think the other aspect to that is also thinking about your personal brand, and whether that is how you show appreciation or how you show gratitude. I think these are definitely important traits to consider in terms of how you communicate. So one thing in particular I'd like to hear you weigh in on is specifically how the thank you letter plays an important role in your personal brand and in terms of how you express yourself. And, you know, do you think this is an important gesture to do? And if so, you know, how can an effective thank you letter contribute to your personal brand and just to the type of impression that you leave on others?
Yeah. So, well, first, let me preface by saying my mother would be so disappointed in me if I didn't send a thank you letter. So this stuff is ingrained in me, and I'm just advocating because of that. But beyond that, it's beyond it being a courtesy. There is a value in the thank you letter because it affords you another shot at showcasing your abilities. I mean, like, think about it, right? During the interview process, if you're lucky, you get an hour to distinguish yourself as the right candidate for a role, but often we don't even get that. And frankly, a lot of EAs, we have the same skills on paper, right? Like, we're organized, we're professional, we're strong communicators. I mean, that's why we're executive assistants. And so how do you go about raising yourself above the talent pool you're competing with? Well, cue in the thank you letter. And that's because it provides an organic opportunity to show your talents, right? Like, it speaks to your sense of professionalism. It allows you to demonstrate your communication skills, like writing, right? And it shows that you're proactive and that you're somebody who's going to go above and beyond the standard protocol. And a little tip from me to you is that when you are drafting a thank you letter, if you can incorporate a point or two that was discussed during the interview process, it's a great way to demonstrate your active listening abilities, which I promise will distinguish you from the pack. And another way to think about the thank you letter is that it's like those Costco samplers that we love, right? Think about it. When you see a new product that you're interested in, you might read the label, right? But like, that's not necessarily going to tip you to buy it. But if you can sample the product and it's good, then odds are like that puppy's getting put in the cart and coming home with you. And like, I mean, how many times have you gone to Costco with a list and you come back with countless amount of unintended items because the sample sold us, right? And so next time there's an opportunity to do so, I do encourage anybody engaging in the interview process to take the time and send a well-crafted thank you letter, because it really does leave a lasting impression. And bonus, it does speak to your personal brand, and it showcases your ability to be an effective communicator.
Yeah, I think that's really an important point. And obviously in the recruiting space, I mean, we receive and relay, countless thank you letters. And there's the ones that are really well crafted and really effective, and you can actually see how they move the needle on someone's candidacy. And then there's those that feel formulaic, ungenuine, just sort of they feel generic. They don't feel like they were really a effective reflection of the dialogue. And I think the ones that really stand out are the ones that do exactly what you just said. They demonstrate active listening, and they say, not only did I thank you for the time, but they're actually saying, here's what I took from the discussion, and here's how that's relevant to how I will show up for you, or here's how, my experience demonstrates my ability to do these types of things effectively for you. But that's really your first test of, do you get this individual? Are you assimilating? Are you paying attention? Are you cluing in on the right things? And so you can convey that effectively through the thank you letter process.
Absolutely. You can't see it, but I'm nodding my head to all of that. Yes.
Yeah. And to all the mamas out there that are mortified to think that their daughters and sons are not being polite, yes, to your mother's point, it's also important for etiquette's sake. Final question for you, Ninni. You're about to be out of the hot seat, finally. You've done very well. You've been in the hot seat for an hour, and you're not even sweating, so you're great. Last question, fun question. If you could support anyone throughout the course of history or time, who would you choose to support and why?
Yeah, Jessica, we've talked about this before, and my answer remains the same. It is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And that's because RBG she's somebody who stood up for what she thought was right. And she really took aim at combating systematic discrimination. But she was able to make an impact without compromising her convictions. And she was able to do that because she was deliberate in her actions, right? From her word choice to the cases she took to her infamous callers, right? Like, talk about a woman who mastered the art of communication. And she's just somebody who, beyond her professional achievements, she was able to have a fulfilled personal life. And that's in large part because of her husband, Marty. But for me, like, that's the ultimate goal of a well-lived life, and being able to work with somebody who I admire in that manner would just be fantastic. And I'll wrap up my answer by sharing a quote of hers that resonates with me. She says, "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that leads others to join you." And I think this is applicable to all aspects of our lives. And I hope that when facing my own adversities, I have a fraction of her courage and grace, and that I'm also able to achieve my own successes in a way that lifts those around me.
Well, Ninni, as always, you could not be any more eloquent. I mean, literally, like, I don't know if everybody just heard the mic drop like I did, but it was echoing. So that was just an amazing punctuation mark to end this discussion. You are just so lovely. Thank you for being so prepared and thoughtful and giving us so much intelligent insight. I really enjoy our conversation, as I enjoy all our conversations. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica, for having me. It's been a pleasure, and it's been fun.
Reach is brought to you by Maven Recruiting Group, who specializes in placing executive assistants and support staff to the Bay Area's most prominent executives and companies. If you've enjoyed being part of our podcast community and are interested in becoming part of our candidate community, we're currently hiring for roles in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Los Angeles. You can visit us at www.mavenrec.com to see some of the roles we're currently working on and to submit your resume.